from Eastern Michigan University, and Ralph Hall. You know Ralph already from the University of Minnesota. Professor Coolage specializes in general philosophy of science topics within such areas as biology, geology, and psychology. And his current work focuses on the confirmation of scientific claims and the realism-instrumentalism controversy. Professor Hall, as you already know, is with Baker and Daniels and is also a distinguished visiting practitioner and professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, where he teaches courses in FDA law, corporate compliance, negotiation, and alternative dispute resolution. Their topic today is Law and Nanotechnology, a primer on the legal landscape.
I recognize that we are standing between all of you and dinner and drinks, and we will keep that in mind. What we're going to do here is actually different than what we've done up to this point in time. So far, all of you have sat out there and watched everybody up here do all of the work. We're going to try to change that a little bit here. And what we're going to do is actually modeled a bit off what a lot of schools, law schools have, including Minnesota. We call it a FWIP, Faculty Work in Progress. And that's what we're going to do here. We have a very specific project, a very specific question that we're going to work on, and we have a proposed answer to it that all of you need to help us with. All right? So you cannot get out of this day without doing some work here. And it's also an effort to demonstrate, at least in practice, how to take the broad concepts we've talked about and try to apply those to a very specific question. And it's also hopefully an example of some cross-disciplinary work. While John and I are here, there's a third collaborator who's not here, who is our science engineering expert. So we're trying to combine engineering, science, philosophy of science, and law with all of this. And I'm going to start, before I turn it over to John for the real work, with a short story. The question, as you see, is asking whether nanoparticles work chemically or physically. I first raised this question about 6 months to a year ago with a professor of chemistry at the University of Minnesota. And I asked, gee, at the nano level, at the atomic level, subatomic, do things work chemically or physically? And she looked at me and she said, and this is almost a quote, "That's the dumbest question I've heard in years." I wouldn't expect that dumb a question, Ralph, from an undergraduate student. Okay? With that cheerful introduction, we're actually friends. We proceeded to discuss how her world and my world have very different needs, because there may not be a difference in her world, but there is a difference in my world. So from a scientific perspective, you folks don't care what we call what you do, right? If today we call it physics and tomorrow we call it chemistry, nobody really cares. My world, however, requires these definitions, and I will actually go through some statutes for you on this. And remember that all of these laws are passed by individuals with essentially almost no scientific training. If you look historically, the current version of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed in 1938. Think who was in Congress in 1938. It was essentially white male Protestants in their 50s and 60s, which means they had their science education during or before World War I. Right? Now, so, well, 62 we made big changes. Good, those people got their science training in the 1930s. I had dinner the other night with an old friend of mine, ex-congressman. He had his science training like I did in the late 60s in high school, right? That's the structure we're working with here. Now, FDA divides products in my part of my world by mode of action, and I'll show you the statutes. Drugs work chemically, devices work non-chemically. If people want a detailed description of the different regulatory requirements, we can do that because I am a regulatory nerd. But trust me that there are major differences for regulatory requirements between being a, quote, drug and being a, quote, device. So the question we've got is, how do we decide what a nanoproduct is? Now, this is the actual statute, okay? The term drug means, for our purposes, articles intended for use in diagnosis, cure, mitigation, et cetera, or prevention of disease, and articles intended to affect the structure, function of the body, right? As an aside, knowing how lawyers like to parse words, Congress had to add subpart C because people were using products in pregnant women and saying, but it's not a disease, so FDA doesn't regulate it, right? So that's why language is so important. That's 21 U.S.C. 321G. 321H, the definition of a device, instrument, apparatus, contrivance, and a pill, by the way, is an apparatus, contrivance, whatever, intended for the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, cure, mitigation, treatment, prevention of disease, or intended to affect structure function, right? Essentially identical, right? So the question is, what's the difference? The difference is in the mode of action. The difference is under a device which does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action. So back up. The difference here and here is Congress then added after this language, which does not achieve its primary intended purposes through chemical action. Hence, I've got to answer the question when people come to me, does this product work via chemical action or non-chemical action? Right? And it's easy if you're talking about tongue depressors or Band-Aids, right? But it's hard in this world. Now, our objectives in this project was to define for this drug-device interaction what is, quote, chemical action in a way that makes sense scientifically, that meets the legal regulatory needs, that we can apply consistently across products, we have some uniformity, and is something that people can actually apply. So that's the purpose of this project. We will go through our current answer to this question, and you're then going to help us refine it. You're on.
Oh, well, thanks. Okay, so I didn't know that Dr. Hall here was going to lead off that anecdote, so I'll share mine too. So I'm sitting around in my living room minding my own business when my partner gets this email. And at the bottom of the email is attached, BTW, ask John what the difference between physics and chemistry is. BTW is, by the way, just for the record. And of course, I had the same response that his chemist did. What do you mean, what's the difference? Philosophically speaking, and I guess scientifically speaking, that is a pretty hard question to answer, a question that's been around for a long time. But before we move on, I'll just share with you the idea that we have that we'll be mulling over for the next short time before dinner. And our idea is that, look, rather than give a strict definition at this point, we've been working on what we like to call an algorithm for dividing between devices and drugs, but we don't have an algorithm yet, so we have more of a heuristic. It's built on these 4 principles. The four principles are just these: the chemicality principle, which, by the way, I don't think is a word, but sounds awesome. The singularity principle, the locality principle, the causality principle. So together we want to say these will distinguish between drug regulation and device regulation for anything. Of course, there's my caveat at the bottom. We're not convinced that these are jointly sufficient nor severally necessary to provide a complete account of chemical action. So as Ralph pointed out, we're not done. But here's our best effort. So being a good philosopher, I started actually thinking about how this is going to work, and actually occurred to me to ask this question, what is this distinction for? Why should we care if something acts chemically or physically? Apparently people in the olden days cared, and I couldn't discern why. So it was no help to us at all to ask this question that was being asked earlier. What is the distinction for? It's just that it exists. So our project actually is to just look at existing regulation, how nano might fit in that. So that fits with some suggestions people have made already. Just use the existing regulations. And so we're working on this very particular question. But our idea was, first, we'll look at what it's for. No answer to that question. So instead, we just started mining the old territory. So we started with 2 problems. The first problem that occurred to me, and maybe occurred to this chemist, the ultimate enemy is bears. No, just kidding. It's physicalism. Physicalism is the well-accepted idea that at the bottom, everything is physics. This is pretty familiar to people who work in philosophy of mind, which I had been doing at the time. Look, are there minds and bodies? 2 separate objects, free-floating minds with experiences, and bodies that are made up of physics, proteins, biology, and so on. And the answer is almost always, hey, look, psychologists, they're just fancy physicists. At the bottom, it's all neurons and electrons firing in there. When your brain dies, you're dead. There's no free-floating minds. There's one thing, physical things. And so this ism generated an issue in attempting to separate chemical and physical action, as you can guess. Look, chemistry is just fancy physics, isn't it? The same way psychology is just fancy physics, as the neuroscientists will like to tell you. You psychologists, I don't know about operant conditioning, but I do know about brain pathways. That's a physical thing. And nanotechnologies, as is a theme that's come up in the philosophy section, aren't particularly special in this case. They just highlight this problem. Because they're so small, it's sort of unclear what kind of properties they would have beyond physical properties. And we've seen already that they actually do have a variety of other properties, but when we started thinking about this was where we were. Okay, so the proposed solution to physicalism, you don't have to go very far. This is what the psychologists said when they were faced with the end of their science. And I think it might be what the chemists ought to say when they're faced with possibly the end of their science at the hands of physicists. Look, we're not really interested in ontology. What's the thing at the bottom? Everything's a physical thing. Look, let's just grant that. Why not? That's really fine and dandy. What we're interested in is whether or not there's certain kinds of explanations. And so I have two examples, and I'm going to mention a third one, that show that explanation and being at the bottom certainly don't have to be connected. The first one's a famous example called Fodor's lunch. So Jerry Fodor's a famous philosopher who says, look, if you want to know if I'm going to meet you for lunch, you don't give 2 cents about what my physical brain situation is. You just want to know if I intend to meet you for lunch. You're going to be able to predict really well that I will meet you if you know what my intentions are. Now, look, intentions are not physical things, or maybe they are, and if they are, it doesn't matter. The idea of intentions, the concept of intentions, predicts whether or not I'll meet you for lunch, and in fact explains when I do meet you for lunch. Oh, John intended to meet me. That's why he's here. Fodor points out quite rightly, look, if you tried to go through it all in quantum mechanics, whether or not I would meet you for lunch, you would never finish that calculation. You wouldn't know if I was going to meet you. You'd be surprised when I showed up. You'd be like, oh, I was still calculating. What are you doing here? That kind of thing wouldn't work out so well. Second example actually comes from Sober in 2004. The Lotka-Volterra equations are actually equations that tell us about the relationship between predators and prey in a population. Now look, predation isn't a concept in physics. Look, stuff eats things, maybe that's a physical process, but predation, lions eat zebras, Venus flytraps eat flies, this idea of predation isn't a physical concept, but it does a lot of work in explaining things. We need predation to understand the Lotka-Volterra equations. Predation, not a physical thing. So explanations and being at the bottom are different. Another example that actually, well, here, let me make this point first. A thing that should be pointed out about explanation that's a little bit different from things we've been hearing so far is that you might be tempted to say, oh, look, it just depends on what you're interested in. If you're interested in meeting somebody for lunch, or if you're interested in the number of predators in a particular population, you're just asking kind of like, this is just your choice. You're just pragmatically interested in those sorts of things. But of course, it turns out that it's true that I met you for lunch based on my intentions, and that it's true that there's a certain relationship between predators and prey in populations. So here, if you use explanation to talk about these sorts of things, truth actually matters. It's not just sort of like choice or, we like to talk about things in this way or that way. This is a matter of scientific truths. So explanation provides this extra little bit of trouble for people who like to think of this as all kind of just a social problem. It's not just a social problem. It's not just how we define things. There's a question, if you want to answer this in a scientific manner, about what the truth is. And so the last example I just wanted to mention actually is, if you look at things at different levels, you can choose what level to look at it at. But what's true at those levels is going to be consistent also. So it turns out that you can provide models that show how many altruists in a particular society we should have. So the number of altruists is relative to the costs versus the benefits and all this stuff, versus selfish people. And so there's an explanation about why, say, I'm an altruist in terms of population. It so happens that I fall in this group. There's also an individual explanation. So if I think I'm going to play these sorts of decision theory games with people who are also altruists, it's better for me to be an altruist on a personal, rational level. So both of those explanations can be true at the same time, and there are different levels. And I only mention this because philosophically speaking, I think that's actually important to coming up with a definition in these cases, that truth matters. This is the part where the scientists get to play too, and we don't need a bunch of social scientists only, or humanities experts or something. So I think that's actually important. That's the first piece. We're going to use explanation for what we like to call the chemicality principle. So look, chemistry and physics down at the bottom, they're all quantum mechanical phenomena, perhaps. But it turns out at least in 2005, I'm sure people will know better by now, that there are a number of chemical concepts, the same way things like predation or intentions or altruism are concepts at different levels. There's a bunch of chemical concepts that chemists use quite adequately to talk about things that are chemical. Molecular shape, molecular bonds, orbitals, chirality, stuff like that. Those are explanations that exist in chemistry, but at least as in 2005, according to these people, there aren't very good quantum mechanical analogs. Now, it might be true, you could describe it that way. It doesn't even matter for us. All that we care about is that there is a chemical explanation of a certain kind. So to be a drug, there has to be an available kind of chemical explanation. The next thing is, since we're trying to define mode of action, we needed to say what a mode of action was. Now, of course, there's lots of ways to understand this, but we chose to understand being a mode of action as being a cause, and that'll generate a problem that we might get to discuss later. But for now, that was our idea. Of course, causation generates its own set of problems. So this is the second problem. First problem is physicalism, and the second problem is going to be this problem that I've called the problem of relata, which I'll get to in just a second. So causation generates some problems, especially in the legal world, which is the world in which I came to encounter nanotechnology, much to the dismay of many people. Look, think about a car accident. Look, if there's a car accident, your lawyer's going to sue everybody. The people who made the tires, people who made the stoplight, the people who decided to put the stoplight there, people who made the other car, the other person, because all of those things are a cause of that car accident. So to be a chemical mode of action, we had to sort of narrow this down a little bit. So here's where we went. Look, we decided to take a probabilistic framework for causation. Ellis developed a version of this in 1991, and that's the one I've been working with, where he says, look, a cause is just a probability increaser. And that fits nicely with the car accident example. Look, bad tires, poorly placed stoplight, poor driver, those are all causes of the car accident. They all increase the probability of that accident occurring. So this generates a kind of problem for us here. It's a problem of identifying the individual causal relata. So relata is just a fancy word for the things that are related. So causation is at least a two-place relation. X causes Y. And we want to know what X and Y are. Without knowing that, we won't be able to say whether or not a particular article operates by mode of chemical action, because anything could create a probability increase. Okay, so our idea was just this then. To be a chemical action, there must be a probability increase in some outcome when it's explained chemically. So what we've been working with is the concept of molecular shape, but we could use one of the other concepts, maybe chemical bond or something else. As long as it's a chemical concept, it'll work for us. And so our current version is a change in molecular shape must explain the probability increase in some outcome. So there's at least part of a resolution to this relata problem. We know that it has to be chemically described. The kind of description we want to use involves molecular shape, although I think at this point we might be willing to go with chemical bond. We're still working on that detail. So at least this is the first step in resolving this relata problem, is we know we're going to be talking about probability increasers. We know that those probability increasers have to be described chemically. That is, they have to be a chemical shape issue or a chemical bond issue or something like that. All right. So in order to continue resolving this relata problem, which actually turned out to be a much bigger problem than the physicalism problem, and bears, consequently, the problem here is that in a probabilistic framework, there can be many causes, just as we said. So X, Y, and Z, and so on might increase the probability of some effect or some event. And we're interested in whether or not the article operates chemically, not whether or not there's a chemical reaction at all. So we had to develop what we call the singularity principle. The singularity principle just says you want to identify whether it's the article itself that increases the probability of some effect, in this case, the treatment, and disregard the other causes of the treatment. So that's our singularity principle. So this is a bit of progress again. The relata problem has begun to resolve. We know that the article, according to the singularity principle, we're going to look at the effect of the article and not something else, must increase the probability, that's the causality principle, of some effect when explained chemically, and that's the chemicality principle. So we're almost there, got our three principles in there. So the effect we're interested in is treatment. We know the two things that are to be related, that is the article under chemical, I only have one thing there. The treatment, whatever the treatment's going to be. So remember, it says we're looking at the intended treatment. And the article, which is the thing that's being introduced, in this case, some piece of nanomaterial. So the final piece of this puzzle is what we are going to call the locality principle. And the locality principle just requires that the article undergo a change in chemical shape at the site of treatment. So not somewhere upstream or somewhere downstream. I mean, one of the reasons we were interested in this particular issue is because imagine you ingest something in a pill and it dissolves. It will undergo a change in chemical shape. But that's not the article that's undergoing it. It's the way in which it was introduced. Or somebody injects something into you. I mean, that's clearly a device. But you have to look at the point at which the treatment occurs to determine whether or not something operates chemically. You don't want to look upstream. And imagine later on there's some chemical process that goes on. It dissolves in some way or something like that. It's absorbed into the body, or it goes back to its initial state or something like that. You don't want to say, well, that's chemical action. That's downstream, perhaps. So the locality principle is supposed to help us identify the where in which this occurs. So if you want to know if your article is a drug or device, you need to know where the treatment occurs. And that's the locality principle. Okay, so I'm just going to look at a pair of examples. The first example is just the silver nanoparticles that we've been talking about a lot. So lots of people are familiar with this article. But we're going to talk about this. And then later I'm going to actually just talk about glue briefly to show a difference. Now, glue is not a nanotech, at least right now. But it'll nicely point out the differences here. Okay, so silver nanoparticles. So it turns out that the exact mechanism by which this has an antimicrobial effect isn't completely understood, at least in 2009 and 2008. It wasn't really clear. It turns out, I guess, the best guesses at the mechanism right now are, one, the silver itself bonds to the cell wall, which creates a kind of respiration problem for the cell and kills it. The second is that at a small enough size, the nanosilver is a catalyst, right? So it releases these positive ions, so positive silver ions. And the positive silver ions actually interact with the DNA structure of the molecule, at least as I understand it. Again, our engineer is not here, so you get the philosopher explaining this. And so the ions actually disrupt the reproduction of the cell. So one, silver attaches to the microbe, killing it. And additionally, these silver ions are released, which interfere with the reproductive behavior of the microbes. Okay, so that's what these guys postulated anyway. I'll take their word for it for now. So heuristically, so again, we have just a heuristic here. I'm just going to go through and see whether or not, well, I guess I already gave it away, but we're going to argue that nanosilver is actually a drug. So silver nanoparticles operate in this way. So we're going to look at our four principles and see how this works. So the first is the causality principle. So the nanoparticles must produce an increase in the probability of some treatment. Here, if the treatment's antimicrobial treatment, that's a well-established result. So we know that's true. Second, chemicality principle. There must be a change in the particles explained chemically that leads to this result. So it's the release of these silver ions that is of interest to us. So because it's small enough, these are released at a greater rate than they would in a larger piece of silver. And it's the silver ions that are released that are actually having an antimicrobial effect. And so that's a change in molecular shape, right? So the silver undergoes, well, I take it it's a catalyst, right? So that means it releases these, and then later it becomes inert. The silver ions are floating around causing these problems, which is a change in the introduced silver article, a chemical change in chemical shape, at least as far as I can tell. So that's the idea there. So it passes the chemicality principle test. That is, there's a change in molecular shape at the site of treatment. So then we want to look at the locality principle. That just tells us where to look. So this change in chemical shape better be happening at the site of treatment, which it is, of course. This is how the microbes are getting killed. So that's good. So silver nanoparticles undergo the change in chemical treatment at the site of treatment, or change in molecular shape at the site of treatment. And then finally, the singularity principle. It's actually the silver ions that do this and not something else upstream. So it's not the injection of the silver ions. It's not the capsule in which you put them in people or whatever. It's actually the silver ions themselves that are causing this change. So boom, done. It's a drug. I take it that's a little bit shocking, but it sounds right to me at this point. So just to contrast it, let's talk a little bit about glue. So glue is used medically to seal wounds, right? So being squeamish, the first time I heard this, I was like, ugh, that's gross. But you just put the glue on. It's like using staples or sutures or something like that. The glue actually seals this. It would be intuitively, legally, and probably scientifically shocking if glue turned out to be a drug. rather than a device. So here's hoping that, that our heuristic works on this. So we're going to consider this. So the causality principle, it's a well-established fact that glue increases the probability of healing of skin lacerations, so passes that test. Chemicality principle, it's true that glue forms a chemical bond with the skin, so I mean that's how it attaches, at least in some cases of glue. It also attaches with itself, so it's looking like it might pass the chemicality principle. The singularity principle, the action of the glue itself must result in the treatment. So I'm going to talk more about this in just a second. It's not true. It looks to me as though it's not actually the chemical action of the glue that causes the treatment. That is the healing of the skin laceration. And so we're going to play with that one a little bit. And lastly, the locality principle. The glue must undergo a change in molecular shape at the site of the treatment of the laceration. And so I think it actually also fails that one, but we'll see. So we said device, and we said device because glue's primary mode of action in this case is not actually chemical. The glue doesn't undergo a change in molecular shape that results in the skin healing. Even though it does seal to the skin in the initial case, that's not where the actual treatment occurs. The treatment occurs when the skin bonds with itself. That's when your laceration's actually healed. So it fails on the locality principle and the chemicality principle. The treatment, that is the healing of the skin, is not a result of the immediate causally proximal change in molecular shape of the glue. That's just how it bonded to your skin in the first place and itself. That's not actually at the site of treatment. And also, there's no change in molecular shape in the glue per se. The glue sort of stays the same. It just sort of hooks up to you. It doesn't change in composition in any real way. It's not a catalyst like the silver. So we said that's a device. Whew, that was close. Got away with one there. So then, in conclusion, such as our conclusion is, the four elements combine to rationally define the separate realms. So we have the legal realm in which we need a distinction between drug and device. We have the philosophical realm where we want an answer to things like physicalism and be able to talk about chemistry as a kind of real thing. And that was the point about the stuff about explanation. And then we have, lastly, the engineering questions. Like, how does nanosilver work? We need to know that. And so I only pointed to the stuff that I could understand. Hopefully people will be able to fill in the blanks a little bit there. If not, it's still not really very well understood. But we need to know a little bit more about how the nanosilver works before we could say for certain it was one thing or another. And our definition is, of course, supposed to be principled, logical, practical, and consistent. So we're hoping that when our algorithm is done, that will be all of those things. And the heuristic, it looks like it actually does some work here. It tells us the difference between nanoparticles, which we have classified as a drug, at least according to our heuristic, and glue, which turned out to be a device. Thank goodness, right? So that's it for us. Hopefully we'll have some questions, comments, and suggestions, and thank you for having us and listening.
The microphones are moving around.
Save me. Do I need saving? Oh, I thought that went pretty well. Oh, this is still on.
While people are getting microphones, we applied this algorithm to a number of compounds, fluoxetine, antidepressants, heart valves, antibiotics, those kinds of things, to see if it consistently gave an answer that seemed logical and rational. So, for example, in penicillin, there is a chemical bonding with the cell wall, which then, as we understand it, disrupts the cell wall synthesis. I told you have to do work.
What if it turns out that the action of nanosilver in a particular case or even in general really is the first thing? The particles attached to the membrane of the cell and interrupt the electron transport chain or respiration. Would that change your...
Yeah, in that case, it would be a device because there would be no change in molecular shape of the nanosilver at the site of treatment. So we're actually willing to take either stand on that. The reason we argued that it's a drug is because of this release of the silver ions, which is an actual change in chemical shape. If it turns out that it's really just the bonding with the cell wall, then we're going to say it's a device.
I would wonder, I work in this area a little bit as a materials chemist, and whether molecular shape is really exactly what you want. Because say if a silver particle may bind to a membrane, that might be a physical process, but it has to do something. It probably takes an electron from that electron transport or gives one up. But the acting like a
Right, that's why actually I've been thinking a little bit more about bonding rather than changing molecular shape. We just started with that because it seemed like the most obvious one, but it looks like chemical bonding might also be a good way to go. So we just require that there be a chemical explanation. So if it turns out this would be good to discuss later also.
I don't want to be pedantic, but we wouldn't even call silver a molecule. We wouldn't have a molecular shape. It would be
Right, so bonding would be more relevant in this case.
yeah, or somehow generalize it to a change in chemical state or molecular shape or something.
Right. Yeah, maybe any one of the above.
Right. Now, if silver were to pierce the cell or something, that might be, you could shoot it in. That might be physical.
All right. Yeah, no, that's good. That's good to know.
Yeah, there's numerous antimicrobial compounds, and silver, of course, is the most widely known. And there's quaternary ammonium chlorides, copper, titanium dioxide. Some of these seem to work, and I say seem because nobody seems to know, by chemistry, by chemical reaction. Some seem to work by physical reaction. So now we got this dichotomy of these come down, they're registered through EPA registration labels. They seem to be registered in the same mechanism. And of course, the Food Contact Service and the FDA gets involved and so forth. That's going to cause you all kinds of problems? Or
it's not obvious that it'll actually cause us a problem. That's actually the problem we were trying to address. It's because we're trying to use existing regulation to regulate these nanotechs. Now, it could turn out that they were just lumped in by accident. In fact, silver, I think, is considered a device, right?
Right.
And our algorithm makes it a drug. So we would be suggesting a revision of this process. But you're quite right to say, even if each one acted differently, we'd be happy to say, well, this one's a drug and this one's a device, mostly because we're not really sure why we have this distinction in the first place. But in order to use the distinction effectively, we would want to employ our heuristic in case by case, not individual by individual, but like by grouping, by kind, I guess.
I'm going to first expose my bias, and then I'm going to go into this question here. My first statement is I do not believe we live in a world of René Descartes, fundamentally. The second comment is that if you look at Kurt Gödel's work on the mathematics of solvability, it seems like this is a circular logic that's inherently inconsistent. And so I mentioned that as a point. But now I'm going to trigger a rhetorical question. Let's say I'm a worker and I'm exposed to nanomaterial X. And now I believe I'm sick. Am I sick?
I take it the question was rhetorical, so.
What do you think?
Oh, I see. You want us to step into that. We didn't take a stand on what sickness would count as or anything.
But in the definition of the statute, there's this question of disease.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Right.
And the reason I mention this is that I have been severely disciplined as a doctor about this, because there are conditions, diseases, illnesses, whatever word you want to ascribe to it, that are very hard to define. There's a condition, for instance, called pseudocyesis, where a woman will literally believe she is pregnant, and yet there is no evidence of a fetus whatsoever. And yet, when you start going down into these very inside the black box of what I like to call the process that probably isn't solvable in my mind, you start asking these questions that I think are really not falsifiable. So that it's just an interesting question, because there are many illnesses that wander around in all our different worlds that we live in that really don't fit any of the aspects, but yet they cause severe morbidity and disability. And the second point I want to make is why wouldn't we approach this as a black box and not ask the question, why do we need to know how this nanosilver works? Go at the beginning and the end. Look at the outcomes of what it does. So if it causes toxicity, if it causes the end result in question, take that and go backwards. Of course, that's my bias being
yeah, that's a good point. So we actually were working from the other direction anyway. We were just talking about upfront regulation. I'll let you jump in just a second. But because the regulatory body already includes this sort of stuff, we just started with that. One of the points you're making is, look, I mean, you're also going to have to be able to identify what the treatment is in order to apply the locality principle. I think that's right. And we've had some discussion about that too.
Because functional outcomes is the end goal. We want people healthy, working, all these other things.
Yeah.
Couple of comments in response. You'll note the statute here, it's not just disease, but articles intended to affect structure or any function. I will now then point out something that we're struggling with that gets really dense because you'll note it's articles intended for use. It doesn't have to work
Yeah,
to be regulated.
That was a serious problem we were having also with this, because our current heuristic treats it as though it is something that will work, right? Because part of it is to identify how it works, right? The mechanism is relevant. So we want to be able to regulate, snake oil or stuff like that too, and that doesn't fall under our heuristic right now. So that requires a little bit of tinkering.
Without interrupting the flow of questions, could all the speakers come up so we could extend this discussion because we're on the general discussion part?
And your other point, we started with the regulatory structure as it exists.
Right.
And so we are therefore locked into how it achieves its intended purpose, not the functionality. Okay, so it was an effort to take what exists and make it apply to today.